welcome to episode 41 on the topic of the biosphere and ecology on a planetary level. Today I want to talk about the interconnected nature of all the world's ecosystems. I want to talk about the biosphere as the thin shell of life that clings to the surface of our little blue world. These topics can't be fully explored without discussing the impacts that humans have on them, how human industrial and agricultural activity is affecting the world's ecosystems and all the organisms within them. So, what is an ecosystem? It's the sum total of all the living things in a geographic region, including the abiotic elements of their habitats like soil, terrain, and climate. The Arctic ecosystems include all the polar bears, seals, and caribou, and Arctic birds, and all the ice, tundra, and treeless mountains that they walk on. In contrast, the Amazon rainforest is an ecosystem of incredible diversity, with thousands and thousands and thousands of species, plants and bugs and animals, fungus and microbes that blanket a landscape thoroughly washed in tropical rain and saturated with sunlight. The Sahara Desert is an ecosystem defined by a brutal lack of water, with sparse life spattered across the sun-blasted sand dunes and fields of exposed mineral rock. In the last few episodes, I've talked about animal behaviors, about population behaviors, and about community interactions between different species. All of these interactions, all of this organic behavior, all of this life perpetuates itself in a self-reproducing tide, and part of this perpetuation is the cycling of nutrients and abiotic resources. Such cycling keeps ecosystems stable. Perhaps the most important part of studying ecosystems is studying how these nutrients and resources are cycled, how they move from place to place, and how they get used and distributed through a habitat, through a biome. The food web is a great concept to touch on here because it shows not just how nutrients are shuttled across a community of species, but because it also shows how energy, chemical energy, is moved and recycled and used to perpetuate species and habitats. The movement and transformation of energy is the fundamental axis upon which all life develops, as all life requires energy. Cells need energy to engage in cellular respiration and to reproduce and grow. And when cells reproduce and grow, complex organisms that are composed of cells will also grow. It takes energy to sustain this growth and to fuel the extremely energy-expensive act of reproduction. Autotrophic organisms are those that absorb energy from inorganic sources, like the sun or a deep-sea hydrothermal vent. These autotrophs have evolved to convert that inorganic energy into an organically accessible chemical energy format. Okay, so we have an energy input, whether it be the sun or some kind of chemical spewed up from a deep-sea vent. And we have autotrophic organisms that can convert this energy into a more organic, bioaccessible format. If you imagine a flat, empty expanse of land, that land will receive a certain amount of energy when the sun shines on it. The sun's light and its heat will warm the ground during the day, and the ground cools off at night. And so this is just basic energy input. When the sun is shining on it, energy is coming into the system, the ground is being warmed, and at night when there's no sunlight, the heat radiates away and the ground cools off. Now imagine this flat expanse of land is covered in grasses and plants. The ground won't be warmed as much because the plants will absorb the great bulk of this incoming light energy, or just physically block it. The plants will convert this light energy into chemical energy. And because these autotrophs convert this inorganic energy into chemical energy, they're primary producers. They're the primary producers of chemical energy because they directly convert that inorganic energy, whether it be that light energy or the mineral chemical energy that comes out of a deep-sea vent, and they turn it into a digestible chemical format. When you take into all of the chemical energy produced by these plants and microbes, you get the gross primary productivity, or the GPP. Now, if you subtract from this the energy that plants need to sustain themselves and to grow, to keep their cells alive and to grow and move or respond to, their stimuli just to sustain themselves, you get the NPP, or the net primary productivity. The NPP is the important variable here. Because the NPP is the total amount of usable chemical energy that's contained within the plant's biomass, within its tissue, its leaves, or its shoots. Or in the case of algae or other single-celled photosynthetic organisms, it's just their biomass, their proteins, and assorted chemicals. When an herbivore eats a plant, it absorbs some of the chemical energy in the plant's biomass, and it uses that energy to sustain its own body. Then the predator eats the herbivore, and the chemical's energy moves across the food web again into the predator's body. Then the predator eventually dies, and it's decomposed by microbes and fungus that take the energy for themselves that way. And so energy is cycled. It's moved through the food web. In this way, the NPP, or the energy contained in the biomass of all of the primary producers of a habitat, this determines how much energy is accessible to every other organism in the region. It determines the maximal extent of the ecosystem as a whole. So how much energy exactly do primary producers produce? Well, first you have to consider how much light energy they're being exposed to. In equatorial regions, there's a lot of sunlight, but in polar regions, there's hardly any sunlight, especially during the winter. Autotrophs can only absorb a limited amount of this energy for various reasons. Most plants have pigments that can only absorb energy from a few wavelengths of light, and the amount of energy conversion depends on the amount of other resources available, like water. To keep it brief, autotrophs generally turn only a very small fraction of the incoming light energy into chemical energy. It's something on the order of a 1% or so efficiency. And this is just the GPP. As the plants grow and their cells perform cellular respiration, they burn energy. A lot of this energy is just lost as heat, which radiates away into the atmosphere or the ocean or whatever substrate the photosynthetic organism is in. Something like less than 0.5% of the incoming light energy gets converted into chemical energy in the plant's biomass. This is the NPP. And even though less than 0.5% is very little, the raw quantity of incoming energy is so high that even this little sliver of NPP can support the hugely complex ecosystems that we see around us. So this net energy, the NPP, is now in the biomass of all of the primary producers in an ecosystem. When you look at a tropical rainforest and you see massive trees and plants and vines just choking the ground and extending dozens, maybe hundreds of feet into the air, all of this biomass, which is millions of tons of biomass actually, all of this is produced by chemical energy that's less than 0.5% of what the sun gives. I mean, if that doesn't put into perspective kind of what the sun supplies to the earth perpetually, I don't know what does. Anyway, this biomass gets eaten and broken down by two other groups of organisms that are present in the ecosystem, called consumers and decomposers. The consumers are obvious. They're organisms that eat another organism. Anything that does that, like an herbivore eating a plant or a carnivore eating some kind of prey animal, that's a consumer. And there are tiers to this too. Primary consumers eat plants, so your typical herbivore would be a primary consumer. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, like a wolf that eats a moose. Tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. And this is like a bear or some kind of apex predator coming down and eating the wolf that just ate the moose, that just ate the plant. Understand that organisms aren't fixed into one tier or another. Humans, for example, can simultaneously be in all three tiers. If you eat a salad, you're eating plants, and that makes you a primary consumer. If you eat the flesh of an herbivore, like you would with a steak or a hamburger, you're a secondary consumer. If you eat a predator like a tuna fish or a bear that you got on a hunting trip, you're a tertiary consumer. Now, decomposers, on the other hand, are much more straightforward. Decomposers eat dead and dying biomass, or detritus, and they break it down on a chemical level. Decomposers usually take the form of fungus or bacteria, as they eat the dead tissue of a plant or an animal, and the dead tissue dissolves. It decays, and the nutrients and chemical energy is leached back into the environment. As consumers eat plants and decomposers eat dead tissue, they take in the energy and nutrients present in the biomass of their food. When you look at these relationships from a wider perspective, you start to see food webs and the emergent patterns of energy flow from primary producers all the way up through tertiary consumers. Things start to get really fascinating when you analyze various aspects of these food webs in various habitats. In forests, for example, most of the biomass by weight exists in wood. Wood isn't really eaten directly. It's mostly softer plant tissue like leaves and shoots that get eaten. And because of this, as little as 5% of the chemical energy in a forest gets eaten from living tissue. The vast majority of the chemical energy is consumed by decomposers as they break down the wood of a dead tree. In ocean habitats, the primary producers are mostly algae, not woody plants. And this algae gets eaten alive way more often than wood does, so up to 40% of the total biomass gets eaten while it's alive. All the non-living stuff, like dead leaves, dead trees, dead algae, and dead seaweed, all get broken down by decomposers, and this energy transfer represents the vast bulk of the total energy flow in an ecosystem. When you look at a typical animal, you see that it eats something, like plants or a prey animal, and it digests that biomass to derive energy and nutrients to sustain itself. But just how primary producers don't convert all of the energy they're exposed to, consumers don't digest all of the energy that they consume. Some portion of the energy in the food is not used. It just gets excreted as waste. Decomposers typically break down the residual chemical energy in this waste, which is why horse manure, for example, is often used as a fertilizer. Decomposer bacteria chemically break down the manure, and this releases nutrients into the nearby soil. Thus, horse manure provides the nutrients that plants can use to grow. Anyway, clearly not all the energy consumed by a consumer is discarded in its waste. The majority of it, greater than 80% of it in most cases, gets used for maintenance and cellular respiration, for sustaining the biomass that already exists. The last little sliver of digested energy, typically a single-digit % of the total energy consumed, that gets used for growth and reproduction. This general pattern creates a kind of energy pyramid. You have all the energy produced by plants and other autotrophs like that, then they get eaten, and a fraction of that energy, usually around 20%, goes up into the next layer in the food web, into the bodies of the decomposers and the primary consumers. As these organisms get consumed by the secondary consumers, about 15 to 20% of this energy goes up another level in the food web. Then the tertiary consumers come in and eat some of the secondary consumers, and they derive about 10% of the energy present in that level. And so this means that total, only about 10 to 20% of the energy in any given level of the food web makes it up to the next level, to the next trophic level. This is why there can be a huge number of plants and a large number of herbivores, but predatory populations tend to be pretty small. There simply isn't enough chemical energy available at that level in the food web for the secondary and tertiary consumers to sustain large populations. It's why predator populations are much smaller than prey populations. Of course, like everything in the natural world, this varies from species to species. Large mammals can retain heat better than smaller mammals, so they tend to be more energy efficient. Same with reptiles, who don't bother using chemical energy to stay warm, and so they put a lot more energy into growth and reproduction. Okay, so now that I've explored energy flow and the trophic levels of the food web for a bit, it's time for me to step back and expand the scope of my analysis. What does this energy flow look like on a global scale? Let's say that you and I are on board a spaceship and we're orbiting the planet Earth to study its life forms and stuff from above, from orbit. If we were to look at the net primary productivity, or the NPP of the planet Earth from space, we would see several distinct patterns. First of all, NPP in the oceans is low. Really low. Water absorbs light pretty quickly, and the light wavelengths that are used in photosynthesis can only penetrate a few meters into the water. This photic zone, where light can still penetrate, it's pretty limiting, because there's no land for plants and stuff to grow on. It's the top of the ocean. The only biomass that can really exist here is some algae that's scattered through the water. and so there really isn't much biomass at all per square meter or square kilometer or whatever, and so the NPP is correspondingly low. It's a bit higher on the ocean floor, especially in areas with warm water currents nearby, but those primary producers depend on chemical energy from deep-sea vents, and so the primary producers are also just microbes, and so the NPP remains relatively low. It's a different story entirely when we focus on dry land. On land, plants and microbes can grow freely, and NPP can be quite high. In places like the Amazon rainforest and the jungles of Mesoamerica, NPP is extremely high. These regions receive a huge amount of sunlight, as well as water, which stabilizes the temperature and nourishes the plants. And so these factors contribute to the dense growth and proliferation of primary producers here. So it makes sense that NPP is high. In contrast, there are areas on land with really low NPP, as low or lower than your average marine NPP, which includes most deserts. The Sahara Desert in northern Africa, the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, and the hellish Australian outback are all regions of the planet where conditions are just not favorable for life, and so NPP is really low. In these hot deserts, there's too much sunlight and too little water. The sun bakes everything during the day, and because there's no humidity, all this heat radiates away at night, and the deserts become extremely cold. These extreme daily temperature fluctuations are difficult, if not impossible, for most plants to survive, to tolerate, and as a result, all of these areas have little to no plant growth, which means little to no NPP. The Australian outback has some sparse vegetation, like grasses and shrubs that dot the landscape, but the Sahara is just raw sand, with dunes hundreds of meters thick, where no life can live at all, unless it's clinging to the edges of an oasis, or a river like the Nile. Essentially, the NPP of any given region is the result of a confluence of several variables: the incoming sunlight, the available water, and the temperature. Sunlight is the raw incoming energy used by the primary producers, so when sunlight's limited, everything else is limited. But water and temperature also play a crucial role. Deserts have just as much sunlight as a tropical rainforest, but the tropical rainforest gets swamped in rainwater, while the desert experiences little to no rainfall over the course of a year. This water input makes all the difference. This water input plus the sunlight creates ideal conditions for plant life to grow. Deserts have all sun and no water, so plants struggle to survive. Marine environments are all water, and outside of the photic zone it's no sun, as light can barely penetrate the upper layers of the ocean, and so plants also struggle to survive. Then there's temperature. Plants can't grow very well in regions that are too hot or too cold, which is why NPP is low in both the high Arctic and the Antarctic, as well as in the deserts scattered around 30 degrees latitude in the northern and southern hemispheres. I should clarify that not all marine areas are so devoid of life as to have a low or non-existent NPP. That's really mostly only in the oceanic areas, in the deeper water bodies like seas and giant lakes. Things are much different near the coasts, where the water is shallow enough to allow light to touch the ocean floor or the lake bed along the coastline. This shallow water creates a photic zone that includes the seabed, and this means that marine plants, implanted in the seabed, growing there, they can thrive because they can access sunlight. There's one critical variable that also influences the NPP of all these regions, but I haven't gone into much detail on it yet. That variable is nutrients. In terrestrial ecosystems, nutrients are held in organisms' bodies, and they're shuttled around the food web through consumption and decomposition. As decomposers dissolve biomass, nutrients leak out and saturate the nearby soil, where plants and fungus can then absorb them and put them back into the cyclical food web. In marine environments, nutrients tend to settle on the ocean floor. In the oceans, this leads to low NPP, as the nutrients fall far out of the photic zone and deposit on the layers of the seabed. But near the coastline, these nutrients are in the photic zone, and so they can be used to feed the plants and support dense animal ecologies. Furthermore, smaller bodies of water like lakes and ponds will undergo a phenomenon called upwelling as the temperature changes across the seasons. I explained this a little bit in the last episode, and it works literally like a flush or a pump where cold water and hot water cycle up and down in a lake, and this kind of creates plumes of nutrients. It's like a flush or a pump that redistributes nutrients throughout the body of water. In rivers, nutrients in the soil or those released from decaying organisms get flushed from one region and move downriver to another region. For example, they often get dumped out at the coastal areas near the mouth of a river. And so these areas, these coastal regions, are often saturated with the nutrients that were carried down the flowing water. Nutrients are really interesting because fundamentally they're just atoms, like carbon and nitrogen and calcium and phosphorus, and thus they aren't really created or destroyed, they're just kind of cycled around. They're shuffled between organisms and between states of matter. Nutrients exist forever. The only thing that changes is the biomass, or the organism that those nutrients happen to exist within. So consider your own body. In your flesh, you have carbon and oxygen and nitrogen atoms. These atoms have existed since they were created in the forge of a dying star, and over the course of billions of years, they've been shuffled through an uncountable number of species. The oxygen atoms in your body have likely been part of a water molecule, which was consumed by an organism and broken down through metabolic processes, only to be reconstituted in the organism's flesh for a brief period of time before being reconverted into another water molecule. And this has likely happened trillions and trillions of times, with every atom of oxygen in your body. The carbon atoms in your body have probably been cycled through even more organisms. Perhaps some of your carbon was first picked up out of the soil by a plant and integrated into its leaves. A herbivore came by and ate the leaves, and that carbon became part of its body. And then a predator came by and ate the herbivore, and the carbon became a part of its body. And then the predator died, and its body was decomposed, and the carbon was either integrated for some time inside of a bacterium or exhaled as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, where another plant might have absorbed it and started the cycle over again. And that too would have happened millions or billions or trillions of times. So all of the atomic nutrients in your body have undergone billions of these transitionary steps in millions, if not billions, of cycles. Listen to me, I'm just saying billions and billions over and over again. But it's true. Nutrients, like atoms, they just get cycled through organisms over and over and over again. And over geologic and evolutionary lengths of time, this really adds up. And so the nutrients in your flesh, they currently reside inside your body. But as you eat food and excrete waste, and you grow and your cells replicate, even the atoms that compose your body are slowly recycled. Perhaps the carbon gets shuffled off of your body in the form of a skin flake, or a hair that fell off your head, or in the carbon dioxide that you exhale. Perhaps this carbon is present in your body when you die, and when you decompose, it will return to the soil to be used by new plants and animals. This is the most fundamental cycle of life, this perpetual recycling of nutrients through billions of organisms over billions of years. You only borrow these nutrients temporarily, for just a fraction of your lifetime, before giving them back to the world around you. In this way, your body is kind of like a Theseus's ship of atoms, perpetually being rebuilt as parts are perpetually lost or excreted or exhaled. And all organisms are like this. All living things are in a chemical flux. They're like a chemical eddy in the planetary flow of nutrient cycling, temporarily hanging onto a few nutrients in a sustained, solid body, before they eventually let them go in some way, either through shedding or through death and decaying, back into the greater chemical flow. To understand these nutrient cycles in more scientific and less poetic words, we can break the cycle down into its basic steps, like uptake and consumption, death and excretion, and decomposition. You might be surprised to hear that decomposition is the most important step in this cycle, because without decomposition, everything else kind of grinds to a halt. This is really evident when you compare similar ecosystems with one critical difference, like a rainforest and a desert that I talked about earlier. They both get the same amount of sunlight, more or less, but one gets a lot of rain, while the other gets no rain. You can also compare a boreal forest and a tropical forest. Both of these ecosystems have extensive vegetation. They're composed heavily of trees and other woody plants, but one is warm year-round, and the other undergoes seasonal periods of extreme cold. In the warm tropical forest, decomposition is relatively fast. It goes on all year. If something dies, it will generally be dissolved into its base nutrients within a few weeks, if not a few days. The heat, the high humidity, and the species diversity all encourage rapid decomposition. But in the colder, boreal forests, decomposition is much slower. There's less species diversity and a lower annual humidity. And during the cold winter months, plant growth and decomposition both slow to a halt. So what's the end result? What happens? In the tropical forest, the dead matter, or the detritus, that falls to the ground, it forms a relatively thin layer on top of the inorganic mineral crust of the planet. This layer of detritus is thin because it gets dissolved so fast that the rapid growth of other organisms demands an equally fast rate of nutrient uptake. There simply isn't enough time to build up a thick layer of detritus because everything gets perpetually cycled so quickly. But in the boreal forests, however, the lower rate of decomposition means that the detritus layer can build up and up, because during the warm summer months, the decomposing organisms just don't have enough time to decompose all of the other dead tissue, all the other dead biomass. And because it builds up, this layer of detritus can become several feet thick, if not a meter thick in some areas. If you were to take a shovel and dig into this soil, you'd find a thick, dense layer of detritus and black humus before you ever reached the inorganic mineral crust beneath it all. I've made a point this episode of emphasizing how abiotic cycles affect ecosystems, specifically variables like sunlight, water, and temperature. While the food web is a fascinating and complex mechanism for cycling biotic nutrients, the physical and geochemical properties of the planet itself influence the cycling of abiotic nutrients. These geochemical cycles operate on a planetary scale, moving water and nitrogen and carbon between and across ecosystems, linking them all together in a single, integrated biosphere. Consider the water cycle, which you probably learned about in grade school. When water is warmed by sunlight, or when it comes into contact with the atmosphere, with air, it evaporates into the air as vapor. And so in places like the ocean, where huge expanses of water interface directly with the atmosphere, evaporation is so common that it outpaces rainfall. Essentially, the ocean is like a cloud-generating surface. On land, evaporation is much less common, as there's obviously a lot less water. The evaporation from lakes and rivers barely compares to that generated by the oceans. But surprisingly, a lot of evaporation comes from plants, who lose water through their leaves by transpiration. All of this evaporated water forms clouds, and the clouds get pushed along by the wind until they get so heavy that they burst and drop their water as rain. A lot of evaporated water gets rained right back into the ocean, but a healthy portion of it rains over the planet's continents, over the dry land. Oh, it's not really dry if it's being rained on. This precipitation goes on to feed all of the plants that live on the land, and it swells the lakes and the rivers that the other animals drink from and swim in. As water just saturates the land, it saturates the soil, and it flows downhill, carrying with it the unsecured topsoil and nutrients back into the oceans. The flow of a river can be remarkably influential on the local habitats and ecosystem. Think of the Nile, which flows through an otherwise dry and inhospitable region of land. The Nile feeds a dense, snaking biome of plants and animals that hug tightly along the riverbanks and spread across the floodplains north through Egypt into the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Plants can alter the density and consistency of the soil with their roots, and this can influence how rivers flow. So life can influence the environment just as the environment influences life. This is really evident when you look at ecological relationships between predators and their prey. More predators means their prey populations shrink. And when prey populations shrink, the plants that those prey species ate, those will thrive because they're no longer being eaten. And so these plants, this new emergence of plant life, this flourishing, might attract other organisms like insects or beavers. And beavers will dam up rivers, and they'll create standing lakes and ponds, standing bodies of water. And this will attract amphibians. And so you can see how all of these species interactions, how all of these ecological interactions have secondary and tertiary and quaternary effects, like ripples in a pond, where they all affect different species and different organisms, and they all can encourage the creation of new habitats and the emergence of new species who adapt to new niches. Because life is ever evolving and ever adapting, it follows that kind of the blankets of life and ecosystems are also kind of like superorganisms or giant living collectives that also adapt and evolve and respond to the environment. But all of this growth, all of this life, it needs more than just water. It needs water, but it needs more than that. The water cycle works in concert with the nitrogen cycle to propagate life. Most nitrogen on the planet exists in the atmosphere in the form of molecular nitrogen, or N2. However, molecular nitrogen has a triple bond, and this isn't easily broken. And so as a result, most organisms can't access the nitrogen in a molecular nitrogen molecule. This nitrogen makes up some 78% of the atmosphere. It's all around us. It saturates all the plants that are outside. But in a cruel twist of evolutionary fate, the plants can't absorb it directly. They can't absorb it through their leaves or break that triple bond with enzymes. In fact, only a small fraction of organisms, like nitrogen-fixing fungus and bacteria, can convert this molecular nitrogen into ammonium or nitrate ions. Essentially, only a small number of these nitrogen-fixing species can break that triple bond and convert that nitrogen into more bioaccessible compounds. Ammonium and nitrate ions are a more bioavailable format that plants and animals can access. Once the nitrogen has been fixed in a bioaccessible format, it's absorbed by the plants as they absorb water. The vegetable biomass of a given ecosystem is a major nitrogen reserve, as the plant tissues require a lot of nitrogen. They're nitrogen dense. There's a lot in the chloroplasts. There's a lot in the cell wall. Animals require a lot of nitrogen too, and often for the same reasons as plants. It's integral to amino acids, and so it's integral to proteins, and to our DNA. We need nitrogen for all of these things. And so when plants and animals die, this nitrogen is one of many nutrients that's broken down and leached back into the soil. Sometimes this soil-bound nitrogen gets washed away in the rain, where it ends up in a marine ecosystem like a river, which gets washed down into the ocean. Here it gets incorporated into marine plants and marine animals, who also die and their bodies decay and release nitrogen. All of this death and all of this nitrogen releasing from decaying bodies into the substrate feeds a host of microorganisms. These microorganisms derive energy from the nitrogen compounds found in the detritus, and through their metabolism, through their metabolic activity and their digestion, they turn these compounds back into molecular nitrogen that makes it back into the atmosphere. So essentially, the nitrogen cycle is perpetuated by microorganisms, those who fix molecular nitrogen from the air and turn it into a chemical format that other organisms can use, and those who take nitrogen from dead and decaying biomass and respirate it back into the atmosphere as molecular nitrogen. The last cycle that I want to cover today is the carbon cycle, which cycles much faster than nitrogen. Carbon exists in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, and photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae take up this carbon dioxide as food. They break down the carbon dioxide to extract the carbon atom, which gets integrated into the plant's biomass, into its tissues. As I've already described in detail, carbon gets cycled through the food web as herbivores eat the plants and as carnivores eat the herbivores. But carbon is also cycled through respiration. As animals exhale, they breathe out carbon dioxide. Naturally, this carbon dioxide returns to the atmosphere, where it can be absorbed once again by a photosynthetic plant or algae. Carbon can be cycled quickly between organisms, between the plants that inhale it and the animals that exhale it, or between consumers and those which are consumed, which mean there's relatively little carbon left in the transitionary stage. The vast bulk of the world's carbon exists in a reservoir, in a biologic reservoir, in the life that swims in the oceans and the life that walks or grows on dry land. Human activity, like our industry and our agriculture, is destabilizing these natural cycles, introducing a degree of chaos in just a couple centuries into a planetary biosphere that's been stabilized by millions of years of evolution. It'll take tens or hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, for the world ecology to find another stable point after humans have gone extinct. For example, our agricultural fertilizers are putting huge amounts of nitrogen into the soil. And while some of this nitrogen gets blown in the wind up north, where it can propagate plant growth in an otherwise sparse ecosystem, the majority of this gets washed down by rain into rivers, which gets dumped into the oceans. And this nitrogen dump feeds algae, and this creates an algal bloom. And all of this growth and chemical activity of the algae kind of sucks up all of the oxygen in the water in the area. When all of the oxygen is sucked out of the water, this creates an anoxic dead zone. And it's characterized by hundreds and thousands of dead fish emerging and floating belly up at the surface. It's not hard to see how this can be really disruptive to an otherwise stable ecosystem. Our industry is pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at unnaturally high rates, which can also promote plant growth in some ecosystems, but overall it causes devastating changes by altering the climate. An increase in carbon dioxide is an increase in a potent greenhouse gas, which causes the planet to experience warming and unusual weather patterns, as well as long-term climate shifts. The worst-case scenario is called the clathrate gun hypothesis, where excess carbon dioxide warms the oceans to a point where the methane clathrates in the seabed melt or dissolve, and it releases all of that methane into the atmosphere. It'll bubble up through the ocean and get released into the atmosphere. This is called a clathrate gun because methane is way more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So its release en masse from the dissolving of all of these methane clathrates, it'll accelerate the effects of climate change exponentially, like a gun suddenly blasting off. I'll talk about all of these changes and how we can prevent the worst of it in the next episode on biodiversity, climate change, and the conservation of our natural world. As for ecosystems and biosphere ecology, I think I've covered all the bases pretty nicely. I hope you learned something cool about how the natural world works on a planetary scale, and about how the physical, geochemical processes and biotic cycles are integrated together into a total biosphere. I hope this episode gave you a lot to think about with regards to how animals and plants interact with the world around them, about how they grow and live and die in regions with varying levels of sunlight, varying rainfall, and an extreme range of temperatures. As always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.